Video games require huge investments to make, usually hundreds of millions of dollars at a larger scale, and a game that fails is usually detrimental to the studio. We're gonna be going over some of these games to see where they went wrong and how they ended up being absolute flops. Suicide Squad, it's like they didn't even learn from the mistakes of the Avengers game, which we'll also be looking at. In most cases, making a game live service comes down to greed. The theme of the game was pretty interesting, as you got to play as the villains and actually kill the Justice League. This is what got me and many fans excited for the game. The hype was even higher because this was being made by Rocksteady, who had a near perfect track record with the Batman Arkham games they've made, but they still managed to mess everything up. It was filled with microtransactions, just like every other live service game. It was repetitive, and that wasn't helped by the fact that all the characters just had guns, so the combat was pretty similar throughout the whole team. Even the Avengers game made sure the combat was pretty unique for each superhero. The game was the last performance of Kevin Conroy as Batman, who's considered to be the greatest actor to portray Batman, and many fans were upset by the fact that he was killed off in this game. They even had a DLC where you could play as the Joker, but apparently even that was a mess. The story is liked by some, whereas others hate it because it doesn't make sense and has plot holes. The game had a very promising concept which Rocksteady could have perfectly utilized had they adapted it as an Arkham style game, but the game just ended up being a $200 million mistake, which can't be said for the next game on the list, Tem Tem. Up until 2020, there'd never been a proper contender for Pokemon, a game that adapted the gameplay style of Game Freak's franchise and was available on all major platforms. TemTem set out to change that. The studio Crema started out their journey on Kickstarter, managing to raise more than $500,000, 8 times their initial goal of $70,000. Excitement for this game was high, and rightly so, because this was the first time a studio made a direct competitor to Pokemon, one that could revolutionize the whole genre. If this game did well, it would have forced Game Freak to step it up, because TemTem was much higher quality in some aspects, like how it was an MMORPG, which seriously expanded the co-op aspect of the game. They also had a unique art style along with memorable TemTem designs, and most different to Pokemon, good battle and idle animations. TemTem was designed to be a better Pokemon game, and that was the cause of its downfall. You know what else is going through a downfall? My financial condition. My bank manager said he'll give me a loan at 800 subs, so please subscribe so that I don't go homeless. As this user says, the monster taming genre is pretty niche, and TemTem needed to stand out to be popular, but they made the game too similar to Pokemon to be enjoyed by players outside the fan base, but also too similar to be played by Pokemon fans as an alternative. Being an MMO, TemTem required the player to be online, which is annoying compared to Pokemon, which you could play whenever, wherever. The MMO aspect placed a lot of expectations in players, most of which weren't met, making the game overhyped. It was initially filled with microtransactions, battle passes, making it feel like a live service game. A lot of the blame comes down to the developers, who seem to be responsible for the failure of this game, according to online opinion. The studio Crema never listened to the community they had and the changes they wanted, but rather fell to greed. They weren't committed to the game and barely added any new Temtems or islands. And now, the developers have ended support for the game, marking the end of Temtem's legacy, while still maintaining servers. Instead, they focused their efforts onto a Pokemon Unite clone, called TemTem Swarm, much to the dismay of the game's community. The studio itself tarnished their reputation by trying to capitalize on a brand that they hadn't developed yet, at the same time abandoning their loyal player base. Many players still had fun, but the game had a lot of wasted potential. This just goes to show that there will never be a successful Pokemon ripoff in a million years. Never. But the story of Skull and Bones isn't quite the same as TemTem. Skull and Bones is a game you've heard being called a quadruple A game, the first of its kind. But the game should be renamed to Skull and Bare Bones because that's what it ended up being. Skull and Bones is one of those games that's been stuck in development hell, facing years of repeated delays, and in this case, several major reworks to the game itself. It was introduced at E3, everybody type RIP E3 in the chat, in 2017. Anyways, they promised an MMO pirate game, but showed off a 5v5 game mode. They delayed the game to 2019, but still showed off the game at E3 2018, which looked completely different this time. Then it was delayed to 2020, and then again to 2022, and then again 2 more times, but the developers promised the biggest open world pirate game and justify the delays. With the final release date of February 16, 2024, Ubisoft presented their near decade-long project to the world with a finalized vision, but it still failed. A lot of it comes down to being overhyped, like how the CEO went as far as to call it a quadruple A game, justifying the $70 price tag. The game was just another looter shooter, with a pirate game skin over it. It was repetitive, had no endgame, and was generally just boring to play for a long period. Ubisoft tried to change the game to be more live service oriented with microtransactions, but that just just made it worse. This was just another attempt by them to recoup their losses, which was apparently nearly $700 million and nearly a decade of development. That's enough to buy 0.6% of Bill Gates. Skull and Bones ended up being an underwhelming game that had sunk too much money in all the wrong places to ever be profitable. But at least there are some people who really enjoy the game, and that's good to know. Many people also seem to have enjoyed the next game on our list, Marvel's Avengers. If I had a nickel for every time a promising studio made a game about a superhero team but then completely fumbled by making it live service, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't much, but it's weird that it happened twice. Following the absolutely amazing game that was Spider-Man, I was excited to know another Marvel game was in the works, one for the Avengers. I was honestly hyped seeing the trailer because it looked good and the combat with each of the heroes seemed, simply put, cool. This all changed when the game finally released. The biggest problem which many high-budget games seem to be facing was that it was an unfinished product, filled with bugs and glitches. The biggest mistake was of course making the game a live service game, instead of focusing on the single player aspect, which could have saved it and was already proven to work with games like Spider-Man, Arkham Knight and more. At the end of the day, this came down to greed, as a live service game with microtransactions would be the most profitable. The game was simply a repetitive grind for non-paying players. The cosmetics you could buy with money didn't even look that great most of the time. Combat was good, but the whole package could have been better. This all combined with the extremely long load times and the lack of frequent updates caused the beginning of the end of the game. Square Enix, the developers who don't have the best reputation, at least did still support the game and its player base consistently with updates and new characters, albeit a bit too late. They added new storylines with Hawkeye, along with Black Panther, and most infamous of all, Spider-Man. The studio really messed up Spider-Man because he felt slow and boring to play compared to the high-octane version of Insomniac's game. Even Fortnite did web swinging better than this game, and that's just sad. But in their defense, they couldn't really have too much speed considering the scale of the game, but it still could have been so much better. The biggest mistake they made was making Spider-Man exclusive to PlayStation, which really lowered public opinion of the game. The game was officially delisted in 2023, marking the end of a game which could have been a masterpiece, if not for certain decisions. At least they still supported the player base till the end, though it still has a lot of wasted potential. And wasted potential is the perfect term to describe the last game on our list, Concord. I couldn't make a video like this without talking about Concord, and that's for good reason. You've probably already heard about this a ton, so I'll keep it short. Concord was supposed to be the next big hero shooter, the one to compete with TF2, Overwatch, Apex Legends and more. Being the studio's first ever game, they were backed up by Sony, who really messed up this game because they barely marketed it, making it so that no one knew about the game upon its release, which resulted in it getting a grand total of just 700 players. The game's failure also came down to other factors, like it just being another relatively uninspired game in an already pretty saturated genre. This all caused the game to be shut down 2 weeks after its release, and all the copies were refunded. It's disappointing to see the studio's first game go down like this, which could have been successful in the right hands, especially considering it took 8 years and reportedly $400 million to make, and if they had kept it online longer and made some changes, it could have gained more traction. Even if a game fails very badly, and even if it's an inherently bad game, it's important to know that there's still been hundreds of developers behind that piece of work, and in case of a AAA game, a loss like that is usually a major blow to the studio and results in layoffs. But that isn't to say that we shouldn't object against the gaming industry being ruined by subpar games. There are still people who enjoy these games even if they are commercial failures, and I think it's good that at least some people had some fun out of them. Plus, as long as I have a copy of Big Chungus under my pillow, I can sleep at night, as happy as a man can be.